Good morning. As y'all know, and you can see in my little, under my picture, my name is River. I'm named after the New River of West Virginia and the Upper Iowa River of Northeast Iowa. These rivers, although inanimate, were friends when I needed to tell my story and when there was no one else who could listen. The New River was there when I first started to understand myself as outside the cisgender heterosexual mainstream, and the Upper Iowa held me up when I first publicly came out as queer and had nowhere to go. These two rivers were places where I met God and received hospitality from the author of all things seen and unseen. Now, I want those of us here to take a couple of moments, punctuated with some deep, deep breaths. And I want you to think about a time when you received hospitality, when you needed it. I'm just gonna give you just a couple moments now to think about that. And then just take a couple breaths. And then I want you to keep thinking about a time when you needed to receive hospitality, when there was a need to receive kindness from a stranger or someone you did or did not know, and you didn't get it. I'm just going to take a couple minutes to think about those things. And then just some questions to think about. How did these times feel? Did you feel like you were being judged fairly or unfairly? Did cultural understandings or misunderstandings play into what went wrong or what went right? Did cultural expectations play into others' decisions to offer you hospitality or not? Do you have ideas about how you might have liked these situations to go? And have they influenced how you offer hospitality in the world? Keep these stories in mind while we look to our scripture for today. Our lessons show that our actions and inactions have consequences. Unintentional, intentional. When you do something, something else happens. And some might call this the procedure of cause and effect. Some might just call it the way things are. But when you do something, there are pretty much always consequences. And these stories encourage us as people who follow Jesus to be aware of the ways that the things we do and don't do impact others around us. And they encourage us to take steps so that we are aware of how what we do and don't do impacts those around us. These stories are filled with ways that intention and impact did not match, and still there were consequences, intended or not. Today, we hope for justice in the world. And part of hoping for justice in the world is making sure that our actions for justice achieve justice. So looking at the first lesson, this admittedly quite long passage from Genesis, we hear about Rebecca. It's in this long narrative of the story of Abraham that started 10 or 15-ish chapters ago and is wrapping up. I think it maybe has one more chapter before Abraham dies. And Rebecca, Sarah, in the previous chapter, Sarah has died, which means it's time for generations to shift. It is time for Abraham and Sarah to become Isaac and Isaac's spouse. And when you're living in this land and you don't know who's here and you've made promises to a monotheistic God, I'm getting some flashing. Okay, we're good. My sermon is not where I can see it and also the Zoom. So when the Zoom started flashing, I was hopeful there weren't technical issues. Take a moment to breathe because now I need to find where I'm at. So none of the characters get the information that's in the first part of the pericope. If you look at the slide, you can see that up until the first big line break, that text is only given to a character I'll call Eleazar. And I picked that name because when you read the Jewish texts, that is the name that the Jewish commentaries gave him, even though he's not named in the biblical text. And so Eleazar, Abraham's servant, gets all this back information of, well, Abraham and Isaac are in Canaan, and Isaac needs a spouse so there can be procreation, and I don't want Isaac marrying someone from around here, so I need you to go back to where I came from. I need Abraham needs Eleazar to go back to where Abraham came from and find a wife. We know that. Eleazar knows that. Abraham knows that. But no one else that Eleazar interacts with in the story knows that, as far as we know. That is, Eleazar, having all this information informing his intent, if you will, understands himself to be on a mission from Abraham, which isn't wrong, to fulfill the promises that God made to Abraham. So not only is this mission from Abraham, it's also from God to prepare for a new generation. Now, before we go to the next part, it is important to note that from Genesis, even before here, and all the way through the Gospels, when you go to a body of water, there are connotations, particularly if you are just hanging out at a body of water. When someone is thirsty, you go and you draw water and you drink it. But also, if, as some young people might say today, you are thirsty and you want a particular romantic or intimate connection, you go to the well, you go to the spring, and you see who comes out, and you meet people. The well functioned like the Tinder, Grindr personal ad of today in the ancient Near East. So here, in this particular story, Eleazar is at the spring because he's got camels and humans and all of these people that need water. It is something that gives life and keeps us moving and functioning as human persons. And also, he's here wife shopping for Isaac. And so he needs to see what's available. He needs to see where God is leading him. He needs to see where connection can form. Operating within these social norms of that day, the story can unfold where Eleazar asks God, asks Rebecca, and Rebecca does these things, and so let's go talk and see if this is an arrangement that works. Now today, to you and me, that might sound a little, you know, maybe not the best, maybe not what we would hope for our lives, but different cultural contexts, different intentions, different impacts. And whatever the case, Eleazar is offered hospitality as a guest, even if there isn't going to be connection. And when the third part of the story comes out and Rebecca is asked, will you go be Isaac's wife? Almost explicitly, that connection forms and the whole power dynamic and structure of the story shifts and changes. That instead of Eleazar being the recipient of hospitality, Eleazar is the giver of hospitality. This is a powerful moment where we can each see ourselves both as people who have received and who have given hospitality. Now think back to those stories I had you think about at the beginning. How would it have felt, and maybe this is true for you, maybe it's not, but how would it have felt if you were able to give hospitality to the people who had given you hospitality before? How would that feel? How would that change your perception of them? How would that change the power dynamics? And so in this moment, when Rebecca has agreed to go with Eleazar back to Isaac, and the story pivots, something else important happens. For the last time in the entire narrative of the Hebrew Bible, we leave Abraham's hometown. Now that land changes hands, it becomes known by different names, but this is the last time it is Abraham's homeland. And that ends our first story. But it's a reminder that unless you know all of the context clues, unless you know all of the cultural norms, unless you know the ways that the society works in and with each other, you don't always know how actions will be received. Now, the gospel takes a much more detailed look at the social norms and how they cast light and shadow on biblical figures. In the first line, John the Baptizer is denied food and water because he has a demon. We can't offer hospitality because there's a demon there. And then Jesus is accused of being a poor host because he has extravagant sharing practices with people cast out from society, like tax collectors, others that were deemed unsavory. And then we hear Jesus pray. We hear Jesus pray. And this is one of my favorite prayers of Jesus, in which he takes these social norms and says, I reject them. I reject them. It's a very different approach than we hear in Genesis. I reject these social norms, and I value these relationships. I value the relationships that I have with you, God. I value the relationships I have with you, these people around me. And I will prioritize these people, and I will prioritize kindness and hospitality over following the social norms that say this person gets thrown aside because they have a demon, or this person doesn't get access to resources because they share too extravagantly. Jesus claims that these rules of hospitality were intended for everyone and that no one needed to be denied compassion, food, drink, or whatever was needed. And then at the end, Jesus reminds us with the words, "Come to me, all you that are weary and are carrying heavy burdens, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." I'll take a moment for another deep breath here. And I want you to think back to the two situations that we started off with that I had you think about at the beginning. And I'm curious, were those moments embedded in stories? I ask this because as humans, we don't live our lives as disembodied moments floating from this Zoom meeting to that Zoom meeting to that Zoom meeting, but as a continuous flow of moments that never stops, from here to here to here to here to here, one right after the other. That is, our lives unfold as stories. This line of thought is core to what is known as process theology, which I believe Pastor Jess has talked about some, and it is one of the primary ways that I understand the world. But it's also important because in this book by Jim Wallace, it came out in 2016, called America's Original Sin, we hear about the story of racism, the original sin of the United States. From the capture, kidnapping, and murder and enslavement of African people for the benefit of white property owners, to the ongoing ways that white privilege and racial inequity continue to keep Black, Indigenous, and people of color down while benefiting the mainstream of society. The ways that white families continue to grow wealth and have enhanced access to resources through generational policies and generational experiences. This is back in Genesis when we see hospitality offered. There's hospitality between equals. Eleazar goes to Rebecca and Rebecca's family as an equal. And here in the United States, there aren't equals. There aren't equals. From something as simple as a Band-Aid that roughly matches my skin tone, to the ability to have an income and have a retirement account, I benefit, and many people benefit, from the color of our skin, no matter what other positions hold us down. This is the opposite of the hospitality we have heard about in our stories today. This is the opposite of the commitments that we made at baptism, which in the LW we say we renounce the devil and the forces that defy God, the powers of this world that rebel against God, and the ways of sin that draw us away from God. Even though those of us who are white will never know the horrors of living in a world plagued by racist policies, platforms, realities, and systems, we can commit to learning more, to engaging with racial justice more, and to seeing where God is calling us in the movement for a more hospitable world. The burden of living in a society plagued by racism distorts every human person from their position as God's beloved. And the commitment to learning about and dismantling racism has been one of the most life-giving, restoring commitments that I have made and that any one of us can make. process theology, that is the idea that we unfold as stories, was super helpful for me in making this commitment. And I wonder if it might be helpful for you. Because it doesn't require knowing everything, knowing anything. In fact, it really just requires curiosity, a desire to explore and see, a desire to learn, a willingness to let those desires grow into thought and actions. And with each shift comes the next outcome. And with that outcome, we get to make a decision, which leads to the next shift and the next outcome. This is a way that God shows hospitality because there's always an opportunity to make the next right choice. And it lets us join God in God's work, learning about and educating and educating, sharing, and learning about racism, integrating racial awareness and racial justice into my work, both as someone who preaches, as someone who studies theology, as someone who cares about the world and wants the world to be a better place, has been one of the places God is calling me. And I wonder if it might be where God is calling you to bring about a more hospitable world. Won't you join me in listening? May the peace of Christ be with you all.
And also with you.